Good evening, everybody. So just a couple things then before we get started. First off, um, your assignment 1 scores and your exam 2 scores, at least your exam 2 short answer scores, have been posted on Canvas, so you should be able to see those. Obviously, you can also see your exam 2 multiple choice scores on Top Hat. Those haven't been put into Canvas yet. They will be, but you can always see where your score is on Top Hat, so you should have those. If you don't have a score, but you did turn in an assignment or exam 2, let me know, and we'll track it down and make sure that you get credit for that. Secondly, I will be giving a second assignment on Thursday. So make sure that you either attend that class or it's going to be posted on Canvas as well in the assignment section. So make sure that you get that. It's going to be due a week from Thursday, which is, I think, November 5th, I believe. But I'll talk a little bit about that in Thursday's class. Okay. All right. With that being said, we are going to pick up where we left off last class. So we were talking about, there we go. We were talking about social influence in general, and more specifically, we were talking about compliance. I had mentioned that there are basically 6 general compliance principles. We have talked about 2 of them so far. So we still have 4 more to talk about. We're going to talk about those today, and then we're going to talk about obedience after that. Okay, so the 2 compliance principles we've talked about so far are, first off, reciprocity. This is the idea that in this society, there's this sort of tendency that we want to treat others as they've treated us. So if someone does us a favor, we feel like we owe them a favor. And as I mentioned, people who want to get you to comply with their requests, to maybe manipulate you or to get you to buy a product, will often make it feel as if they've done you a favor so that you feel a need to return that favor by, for instance, buying their product. That was the principle of reciprocity. We've also seen the principle of commitment and consistency. This is the idea that once we make a public commitment, we are motivated to behave consistently with that commitment. We've seen that before when we talked about cognitive dissonance. It creates cognitive dissonance if our attitudes and our behaviors don't match. And it's coming up again in this compliance section as well. So again, what people will do if they want to get you to comply with something is if they can get you to publicly commit to something, then you're more likely to follow through with that commitment later on, because we want to be consistent with their past commitments. A third compliance principle that we have not yet talked about is one known as social proof. This is the basic idea that we tend to view a behavior as correct in a given situation to the degree that we see others performing it. It's very much related to the idea of conformity. If we see other people engaged in the same behavior, we tend to oftentimes conform our behavior to match theirs. It just got a slightly different twist on it, in that we tend to view that behavior as correct if we see a lot of other people performing it as well. And again, what that means is that people who want to get you to do something can manipulate social proof. They can make it look like everybody is doing a certain behavior or engage in some certain behavior in an attempt to use social proof to leverage that to get you to also engage in that behavior. And so if you see commercials, for instance, where maybe they stop people on the street and ask them about a product, everyone in that commercial seems to love their product. But of course, what's happening is they're editing out anyone who doesn't love their product. So as a consequence, what you see in that commercial are only people who like the product. So it seems as if everyone is in agreement and everyone's engaged in the same behavior, which is that they're using this product. That makes it more likely that you're going to buy that product yourself. So this is often accurate, and we've seen this in conformities, that there are situations where it's a good thing, or at least it might be useful to conform our behavior. If we don't know what the correct response is, our natural inclination is to look to other people to figure out what that correct response is. And sometimes that can be useful if you're in a foreign country and you don't know what the customs are. Then possibly conforming our behavior to that of other people might be useful in that situation. But it also means that we could fall prey to false social proof. And false social proof is what I alluded to a second ago, where people can manipulate it to make it look like everyone's engaged in the same behavior. And I want to give you a couple examples. I've always hated sitcoms that have a laugh track. because they don't really make any sense to me. I mean, you're watching, let's say, two people in an apartment and one person makes a joke and suddenly there's 50 people laughing off screen. And those 50 people don't exist in the universe that I'm watching on TV. So why is it that we so readily accept the existence of these laugh tracks in sitcoms? It always seems really strange to me. One of the reasons, maybe the primary reason why a lot of shows, why I love comedies, use laugh tracks is because the audience tends to view jokes as funnier if they hear other people laughing at them as well. You can discover this for yourself. On YouTube, you can find different comedies that have removed the laugh track. So I know they've done this for like The Big Bang Theory. I think there's other comedies they've done this for as well. And when you watch these shows with the laugh track removed, it feels very odd. It doesn't feel as funny. And part of the reason for that, I guess the entire reason for that, is because we're not hearing other people laugh. And because of the principle of social proof, we view behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it. If other people are laughing, we view that as the correct behavior. We tend to find those jokes funnier. So that's partly the reason why they tend to use this canned laughter on sitcoms. It's sort of a way to manipulate you into thinking that jokes are funnier than they really are. If anyone works in the service industry and you get tips, I've got a tip for you. And that is this. If you've got a tip jar that you put out, let's say that you're a bartender, let's say, and you've got a tip jar that you put out. One of the best things you can do to increase the amount that you make in tips is to put some of your own money in that tip jar at the beginning of your shift. The idea is this. If I, as a customer, go up and let's say I order a drink from you, because you're a bartender, and I see that there's a tip jar and there's no money in there, then I take that, I infer that that means that no one else is tipping and therefore I don't really need to as well. But if, on the other hand, I go and buy a drink and I see there's a whole bunch of dollar bills in that tip jar, then because of the principle of social proof, I view that behavior as correct. I view a tipping behavior as a correct behavior because apparently other people are doing it. As a consequence, I'm much more likely to tip if I see money in that tip jar. So putting just a few dollars of your own money in a tip jar should help you make more money in tips because of the principle of social proof. Earlier, when we talked about cognitive dissonance, we saw this, we had talked about this doomsday cult, right? The idea here was that this cult believed that the world was going to end and these aliens were going to come down and take them aboard their spaceship and save them before the world ended. And if you recall, what happened in this case is that when the aliens didn't come, instead of these people abandoning their beliefs, what they did is they convinced themselves that in fact they saved the world. And because they saved the world, the aliens didn't need to come and save them anymore. So that's how they rationalized or justified their beliefs, and in particular, the fact that their beliefs seem to have been discredited when the aliens didn't come, right? So one thing I didn't mention, kind of a more minor point, is that within this cult, prior to the date they thought the world was going to end, they didn't really talk to a whole lot of outside people. They more or less kept to themselves largely. But what happened is that when they convinced themselves that they had saved the world, that they had spread so much light into the world, that they had saved the world, they started getting on the phones and talking to media outlets and other people, trying to convince them that they had saved the world as well, which is kind of an odd behavior considering that the cult had sort of been isolated for the most part before and hadn't really talked to a lot of people on the outside. But it makes sense in the context of the principle of social proof. Because if we view a behavior as correct to the degree that we see others performing it, well, the same principle applies to our beliefs. We can convince ourselves that our beliefs are correct if other people also believe it as well. And so these people who, in order to try to get rid of their cognitive dissonance, had to justify to themselves that they had saved the world, they needed to convince themselves that they had in fact saved the world. And one of the best ways they had of convincing themselves that they had saved the world is that if they could convince other people, it was easier for them to believe that they had saved the world as well. And that's why they started to make these outside contacts, because of the principle of social proof. I'm seeing that people are seeing me lag. I'm going to quickly change my internet. Oh, I guess I'm already on a good internet connection. Okay, never mind. I guess I'm already on it. My internet's been acting up a little bit. I apologize for that. I hope those issues have been resolved. Okay. So back in, I'm assuming this must be Italy, a long, long time ago when they were putting on plays, there were people called clackers who would basically be paid to sit in the audience of these plays and to applaud and to cheer, kind of like a laugh track works today. It's kind of the equivalent of that, but it was for plays. This was a menu card, basically, that one company had, and this would show how much they would charge a theater company for various things. So, for instance, if they wanted, if this theater company wanted people in the audience to applaud on the entrance of a gentleman, then it would cost them 25 lira, right? It would cost them different amounts of money for different things, for applause or for wild enthusiasm or whatever. And the thing is that everybody at the time knew these people existed. They knew that there were people who were paid to cheer, who were paid to applaud these plays. But the thing is, it didn't matter, because the fact that people in the audience were cheering and applauding made other people in the audience, the paying customers, it made them like the play more. Just like today, hearing a laugh track, even though you know that laugh track is canned and it's like manipulated, or there's an audience and they're told when to laugh, you know it's all being manipulated. Even though you know that, you still tend to find the sitcoms funnier today, just like these people thought the plays were better, even though they knew these people existed that were paid to cheer. And this is because the principle of social proof works, even though we often know that social proof can be manipulated. We're still influenced by it. We still have that natural tendency to be influenced by it. We can use social proof to explain a lot of other interesting phenomena as well. Here are some data showing the suicide rate, the number of suicides, but in particular, what this graph is showing is the difference in the number of suicides compared to what would be expected. So any bar that goes below this zero line means that there are fewer suicides than would be expected based on historical data. And any bars that go above the zero line means that there were more suicides than they would have been expected based on historical data. And what these researchers looked at is the number of suicides as a function of a highly publicized suicide story. So if you have a celebrity, for instance, who killed themselves and it was publicized everywhere, they looked to see whether that influenced other people to commit suicide as well. And so what these data show is that the month of that highly publicized suicide of let's say, a celebrity, the suicide rate jumps, okay? This doesn't mean there were 1,400 people who killed themselves. This means there were 1,400 more people who killed themselves than would be expected in the month of that story. And this number here shows that there's about 900 or so more people who killed themselves than you would have expected based on historical data. So altogether, we're looking at an increase of about 2,300 people. These are people who presumably killed themselves only because of this highly publicized story. After about 2 months, the suicide rate goes back to roughly what would be expected. What these data are suggesting is that there are some people who are maybe depressed or who are maybe considering suicide. They're not quite sure if they want to do it. And when they read about this highly publicized suicide of a famous person, that basically tips them over the edge and leads them to commit suicide themselves. Now, obviously, it doesn't lead people who weren't considering suicide to begin with to commit suicide. These are people who might have been considering it already. But what this is indicating, again, is consistent with social proof, which is if we view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it, well, if we read about or if we hear about a highly publicized suicide, that tends to make it more, that behavior to be, we tend to perceive that as more likely to be correct, right? And so that can lead people, that can kind of tip them over the edge potentially to commit suicide themselves. At the beginning of class, we talked about Jonestown. This is where 974 people ended up drinking from a vat of poisoned Kool-Aid, basically, and killed themselves, including killing their own children. It was the very first week we talked about this. And certainly why hundreds and hundreds of people kill not only themselves, but their children, we certainly can't explain that using just social psychology. It's a very, very complex process here. However, one of the issues that might have played a role in convincing some of these people to kill themselves is this principle of social proof. Because what happened here is that if you are one of these people, one of these almost 1,000 people in this audience, and you're being told by Jim Jones, the leader of this organization, that you need to kill yourselves, basically. I mean, you're not sure, like, you can't believe that he's asking you to do this. And yet you start seeing dozens of people go up and drinking from this poison vat of Kool-Aid and killing themselves. Well, because we view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it, that starts to feel like the appropriate behavior, right? It starts to feel more like an acceptable and behavior, potentially behavior that you should do as well. So the principle of social proof might have played a role in what happened in the Jonestown suicide. As I said, there's probably a whole bunch of other things going on as well, but this might have played a role in it. So when does social proof work? Well, as a general rule, I mentioned this before, we've seen this before in class, we're going to see it again, is that as a general rule in social psychology, when we don't know what the correct behavior is, the first thing we do is we look to other people to figure out what they're doing. We saw this, for instance, in the section on conformity. We saw this in when we look at when people try to evaluate themselves with social comparison theory. If we don't know how to evaluate ourselves, we look to other people. It's a general rule that pops up again and again in social psychology, and the same rule pops up in the with social proof as well. When we're unsure of how to act, that's when we look to others to figure out how to act. So that's when social proof tends to produce its strongest effects, when we're not quite sure what the correct behavior is. Furthermore, we're more likely to engage in social proof with people who are similar to us. And again, we've seen this with social comparison theory, when if we want to learn about ourselves, we tend to compare ourselves with people who are similar to us. We saw that before in this class. And we're seeing the same thing pop up again when we look at social proof. When we don't know what the correct behavior is, we tend to look to other people. And specifically, if we can, we tend to look to similar other people. They're the people who give us the best information about what behavior we think we should engage in as well. And I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago with these person on the streets ads. And I've sometimes seen these where people are selling sunglasses or whatever, and they stop random people on the street and they have them try on sunglasses, and the people rave about how great these sunglasses are. And there's a couple of reasons why that works. I mentioned that that's partly due to social proof, because they're editing out anyone who doesn't like the sunglasses. So the only things you're seeing are people who like these sunglasses. So they're manipulating that social proof to some extent. But furthermore, because they're stopping random people on the street, supposedly, then it makes it look like these are just average people. They're not actors. They're people like you. You could have been walking down the street and you could have been stopped by someone and asked your opinion on these sunglasses. So in other words, these people are, in a sense, similar to you, right? The very people we tend to look to figure out how we should behave. And so that's partly why these ads are so successful, because they rely on the principle of social proof. If you ever watched like the Home Shopping Network, a lot of the times when they're selling a product, they'll have a little counter in the corner which ticks off all the people who have bought their product. Now, I don't know if that's actually what it's ticking off. It could just be manipulated, I'm not sure. But the point is, the reason that they're showing you that counter is because they're showing you that other people have bought this product. And because other people have bought this product, you should buy it as well. And the only reason that works is because of this principle of social proof. Okay, so that's social proof. A fourth principle of compliance is that of liking. This is the basic, simple idea that we're more likely to comply with people that we like. Okay, that should be fairly obvious. We've seen in the persuasion section, for instance, that people who are on the peripheral route to persuasion are more likely to be influenced, be persuaded by people that they like. And the same principle applies with compliance as well. We're more likely to comply with people that we like. So of course, the question is, what determines whether we like someone or not? And later on in the semester, I think before exam 3, we are going to look at attraction. We're going to look at some of the factors that determine whether we like people or not. So I'm not going to go too in depth in this right now, but I'll just mention a couple factors. First off, something that we'll also see when we look at attraction, we tend to like people who we find physically attractive. Again, we saw this in the persuasion section as well. We tend to be more persuaded by people we find physically attractive. Part of the reason this works is due to what's known as the halo effect. What the halo effect means is that if we believe that a person has a positive characteristic, we tend to also think and assume they have all sorts of other positive characteristics as well. You can kind of think of it this way. We kind of like to think about the world in a simplistic way. We don't like a whole lot of cognitive complexity. We've seen that before in this class as well, right? We don't like cognitive complexity. We like to simplify the world. And so if we see that someone has a positive characteristic, it makes the world really easy to think about if we just assume they have all sorts of other positive characteristics. We can then classify that person. That's a good person. The same thing, if someone has one bad characteristic, we like to assume they have all sorts of other bad characteristics as well. They're a bad person. Makes the world very easy to think about. Because of that, when we encounter someone who has a positive characteristic, such as we find them physically attractive, we have this natural tendency to also assume that they're generous and honest and trustworthy, et cetera, that we ascribe all these other positive characteristics to people as well. Consequently, if someone's physically attractive, we tend to assume they're trustworthy, and if they're trustworthy, we should comply with them. So that's known as the halo effect. The opposite of the halo effect is sometimes called the horns effect or the devil effect. That just means if we know that someone has one negative characteristic, we assume they also have a bunch of other negative characteristics as well. But we usually talk about this effect in terms of positive characteristics, so it's called the halo effect. We also tend to like people who are similar to us, and this should make sense as well. We've seen before in this class that we tend to like ourselves an awful lot. We have really high self-esteem for the most part. And so therefore, if someone's just like me and I like myself a lot, I'm going to like them a lot as well too, right? And so we tend to like people who are similar to us. We saw that with persuasion. We're going to see it again when we look at helping. We're more likely to help people who are similar to us, etc. But we're going to look at that later on in the semester. But we just tend to like people who are similar to us. We also tend to like things that are familiar to us. And this is due to something known as the mere exposure effect. Now, what the mere exposure effect means is that if you're exposed to something, this could be something like, let's just say, assuming you don't speak Chinese, like a Chinese character, okay, that you've never seen before. If you've been exposed to that, if you've been shown that Chinese character repeatedly, and then I later ask you to rate how much you like that Chinese character, how much you like it aesthetically, how pleasing is it to you, the way that it looks, you tend to like it more if you've been exposed to it numerous times in the past. In other words, the mere fact that you've been exposed to something leads you to like that thing more. Now, not all the time. This generally only occurs if we are at least neutral or slightly positive towards it in the first place. So if you hear a song you really hate, if you hear it 50 times, you're not going to like it more. You're going to hate it even more after 50 times, right? But if you initially hear a song that you're kind of neutral or maybe slightly positive towards, you tend to like it after you've heard it a few more times. Now, there's limits to this. Obviously, if you hear a song that you initially like 100 times in a row, you're going to hate it after a while. But for at least some period of time, the more you're exposed to something, the more you tend to come to like it. It's known as the mere exposure effect. And that's true as well of people. So the more you're exposed to a person, the more you tend to like that person over time. Again, assuming you don't initially dislike them. And not only is it true for people, but it's true for ourselves. Let me give you an example here. So if you think about the contexts in which you see your own face, there's really mainly only two contexts in which you see your own face. First off is in pictures, right? And secondly is in the mirror. And you probably look at yourself in the mirror multiple times every day, right? Well, the image you're seeing in the mirror is not your true image. It's your flipped, your mirrored image, right? So if you have a mole on one side of your face, it's going to be on the other side of your face in the mirror image, right? So everything's flipped. So what this means, what some researchers reasoned, is that if the mere exposure effect is true, and if we largely see our mirrored image of ourselves in the mirror, well, if I gave you the choice, if I put up your true image and your mirror image right beside each other, and I forced you to pick which one do you like better, well, because of the mere exposure effect, you should tend to like your mirror image more because you look at yourself in the mirror all the time. On the other hand, if I asked your friends which of those two images they liked more, your true image or your mirror image, your friends should tend to like your true image more because they spend more time looking at your true image. And so some researchers conducted this study. And what they showed is this. This is the percentage of people preferring either the true image or the mirror image. So if you look at participants themselves, if you look at the percentage who preferred their true or mirror image, the majority of participants preferred their mirror image to their true image, consistent with the mere exposure effect. But when you look at those people's friends and you ask them which image they preferred, the friends of the participants preferred the participants' true image rather than their mirror image. Okay. This is all consistent with the mere exposure effect. And one of the things this means is that the images of yourself that you like are not necessarily the images of yourself that other people like. And so if you're posting images of yourself on Facebook, for instance, or on Instagram or on a dating site or something along those lines, we tend to pick out the images of ourselves that we like the best. In fact, what this might suggest is that if anything, we should probably ask our friends which images of us they like the best and post those images. So we can take what we've learned with the first 4 compliance principles, and we can use them to explain why the company Tupperware was so unbelievably successful using kind of a unique business model for a long period of time. And so what Tupperware did is they would have these Tupperware parties. And so they'd have a representative from Tupperware go to someone's house, that could go to your house, for instance, and have a little Tupperware party. You would invite your friends, they'd all come to your house, and you'd play little games and you talk about Tupperware. And at the end of the day, you're able to buy Tupperware from the Tupperware representative. And if you hosted the party, you get a bit of a cut of the profits. And using that sort of business model, Tupperware made billions of dollars. They made a fortune doing this. And part of the reason they were so successful using this interesting business model was because it capitalized on each of the 4 compliance principles we've already talked about today. So for instance, what they would do is that when they're playing your little games at this Tupperware party, people who win games would get a little prize, a free prize from the Tupperware representative. So in other words, it feels like the Tupperware company is doing them a favor. And because of the principle of reciprocity, we feel a need to return those favors. And so those people were more likely to buy Tupperware at the end of the party. Furthermore, while talking about Tupperware and playing these games, the Tupperware representative would get people at the party to talk about why they like Tupperware and what Tupperware they own and that sort of thing. And so people are basically verbally and publicly committing to the idea that I use Tupperware and I like Tupperware. And because we want to behave consistently with our past commitments, then by getting people to do that, those people are more likely to buy Tupperware at the end of the party as well, to be consistent with their past commitments. Furthermore, if you're at one of these Tupperware parties and the Tupperware person has all their Tupperware on display and you're able to buy it, and you see other people buying Tupperware, well, because of the principle of social proof, we view behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it. If other people are buying Tupperware, that feels like the correct behavior. We're more likely to buy Tupperware ourselves. And furthermore, because we look to people that are similar to us, mostly when we engage in social proof, and because our friends tend to be similar to us, they're the very people we're most likely to look to figure out what our behavior should be. And so social proof helps and contributes to why Tupperware made so much money. And finally, the principle of liking comes into play as well, because if you buy Tupperware at one of these Tupperware parties, you're partly buying from Tupperware, but the person who's hosting the party, who's a friend of yours, gets a cut of the profits as well. So in a sense, you're buying from your friend, and we like our friends. And so as a consequence, if we're buying from our friend, we're more likely to comply and buy their products as well. I've got 2 more principles to talk about. 5th principle is the principle of scarcity. And this principle just means that opportunities or things seem more valuable to us when they are less available. Okay. Now this can happen in a couple of different contexts, and I'm sure, and I'll show you some examples of ads, but I'm sure you've seen ads that say for a limited time only or while supplies last. And these ads are designed at making you feel as if time is running out and you only have a limited window in which you can buy this product. And if you miss that window, you're never going to be able to buy it again. Because these opportunities, these things, these products seem more important, they seem more valuable to us when there are fewer of them available. So there's a number of contexts in which we see this. So here are a few key phrases to look at. Things like while supplies last only, time is running out, limited quantities for a limited period. These are all phrases that are designed to make it feel as if you're going to lose an opportunity unless you buy this product now. But if you think about it, these phrases are meaningless. While supplies last only. Well, no kidding. Of course you can only buy something while the supplies last. That's true of literally everything. So that's basically an empty phrase, right? Limited quantities. Well, yeah, no kidding. There's not an infinite number of anything. So of course there's limited quantities. Or for a limited period, yeah, the offer won't exist in perpetuity until the end of time. It's a limited period. So these are empty phrases that don't mean anything, but it makes us feel as if time is running out, as if our opportunity is running out and we need to buy this product right away. Again, the Home Shopping Network does this as well, right? When they're selling a product, they've got a countdown, like a timer, countdowns from 3 minutes, and you can see it count down second by second till time runs out. And part of the reason they do that is because it makes it feel as if your opportunity is running out. Now, I guarantee you, if you call them up 1 second after that timer runs out, they're going to sell you that product, okay? It's not like you lose that opportunity when that timer hits 0, but they're making you feel as if your time is running out because of the principle of scarcity. Here's a study you guys all wish you did, because all participants had to do was eat cookies. And what the researchers did is they simply had people taste test cookies from a jar that either had 10 or a jar that had 2. And the cookies were absolutely identical in both jars. But they had people rate how much they liked the cookies, how much they'd be willing to pay for that cookie, et cetera, et cetera. What they showed is that people liked the cookie more if it came from a jar of only 2 cookies rather than if it came from a jar of 10 cookies, even though the cookies were absolutely identical. The reason being is because they felt scarcer. There were fewer of them. And because of the principle of scarcity, we find things more valuable if there are fewer of them. This is related to a concept we've seen before. In the persuasion section, we looked at the principle or the idea of psychological reactance. That's the idea that if I take away one of your freedoms, you feel a need to want to re-exert that freedom, right? If I tell you you can't do something, then you just want to do that one thing, just to prove to me that you're your own person, that you get to decide what you get to do, right? That's the principle of psychological reactance. And you can see how that applies to scarcity as well. Because if I'm a company and I say, you only have 2 days left to buy this product, then you'll never have it again, there's a sense in which that invokes a sense of psychological reactance. Like, you're telling me I can't buy that thing? Well, I tell you what, I really want to buy that thing now. And so we're more likely to purchase that product. So scarcity works for a couple of different reasons. One of them, note that there's a link between scarcity and social proof, right? Because if something is scarce, if there's only a few of them left, not only does that tell you that there's a limited time that you have to buy it, but it also suggests that everyone else is buying it, and that's why there's only a few of them left. So because it implies social proof, and because social proof makes us more likely to engage in that behavior, scarcity works in that way to increase our likelihood of purchasing something, let's say. But a second reason it works is because we don't like to feel regret, right? If we have an opportunity to buy something, and then we miss that opportunity, and we're never able to buy that thing again, we might feel regret at not having taken the opportunity to buy it when we had the chance. And we can anticipate feeling that regret in the future. So if we're presented with an opportunity and we only have a limited time to buy this product, we're sometimes scared that we're going to lose that opportunity. We don't want to feel regret later on. So just in case, to avoid that potential future regret, we'll often buy the product now just so we never have to face it later on. We hate to lose an opportunity that we once had, in other words. Finally, a sixth compliance principle is that of authority. And this is the basic idea that we tend to comply with authority figures. And that's true, interestingly enough, even if the authority is completely unrelated to the request. Now, this was a little while ago, but back when, do you guys remember what was it, Hansen versus Predator, or To Catch a Predator? That's what it was called. This was on a little while ago, so it might have been before your time. But basically, where people would show up thinking they were chatting with an underage person when in fact it's just an undercover agent. And then Chris Hansen, the interviewer, would come in. And usually when Chris Hansen would come in, he would tell the person who was there to meet this underage person, hey, please have a seat. I have some questions to ask you. And most of the time, the person would have a seat and would often answer questions from this person. But why would they do that? Why would they sort of mindlessly comply with these people? Why wouldn't they just leave if they knew that they'd been caught, right? Well, part of the reason is because of the principle of authority, that we just have this natural, almost mindless tendency to want to comply with authority figures. And that's true even if the authority is unrelated to the request. So I'll give you an example. This is a study where participants, or I should say the researcher, was watching parking spots on the side of the road. And so someone would pull into a parking spot and there'd be a parking meter there. And they'd be putting money in the parking meter, okay? This is the unwitting participant at this point. Now, right in front of that person, the parking spot right in front of them, was another person trying to put money in the meter, kind of going through their pockets looking for change, but they couldn't find any change. Now, this is someone working with the experimenter. So what would happen is that someone would come out from behind a building. They would point to the participant, the person who was putting money in their own meter. They'd point to that person and say, hey, you there, you give that man a quarter, pointing to the other man who's trying to find money to put in the parking meter. Now, that person who gave that request, or that demand really, was either dressed as, I think it was plain clothes, or dressed as a security guard, I think it was. And what they showed is that when that person was dressed as a security guard, people were more likely to comply and to give the person a quarter for the parking meter. But why is that the case? A security guard has no rights, or no right in terms of telling you to give someone else money, right? They have no authority over you. They can't tell you to give someone else money. That their authority in that sense is completely unrelated to the request that they're making. But because of this natural tendency that we have to sort of mindlessly go along with authority figures, people tended to comply with that, even though that person was only a security guard and had no authority over them. Interestingly, the police also know this, right? So the police will often use this against you. So when you're questioned by police, except for like maybe your name and something, you don't have to answer police questions, right? And in fact, in many cases, you shouldn't answer police questions because they're sometimes trying to get evidence and to build a case on you and things like that, depending on the situation. But it becomes really hard for us to say no, even though we have the right to say no and to not answer police questions. It becomes hard for us to do this because of this tendency that we have to obey authority. And the police know that, and they will often use that to try to get information out of you, to try to get you to incriminate yourself. So if they ask you things like, if they pull you over, can I search your car? You have every right to say no. But it becomes really hard to not allow them to do that in that situation because of this tendency that we have. And so that's also another reason why it's really important to know what your rights are so you know how to exercise them. But all this being said, the principle of authority as it relates to compliance is maybe better thought of in the next section we're going to talk about when we talk about obedience. So I'm not going to talk any more about authority right now. We're going to talk about obedience as the next section. Oh yeah, and I agree that they do not like it when you say you don't answer questions. I'm sure they don't, but they can't make you. Okay, but here's what we're going to do. Before we go to the section on obedience, let's have a top hat quiz. So open your top hat. This quiz should be fairly easy because it's just covering what we just talked about, stuff on compliance. So every question, for every question, you're going to have to pick out the compliance principle that explains the phenomenon in question. So for question 1, which compliance principle explains why people liked cookies more than when there were only 2 of them instead of 10? So the principle of reciprocity, of scarcity, of social proof, or of commitment and consistency. Yeah, 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, this one should be pretty easy because we just covered it. But obviously this is due to the principle of scarcity. Right, so overwhelmingly that was a pretty easy one. Question number 2, which compliance principle explains why people find sitcoms funnier when there is a laugh track? Reciprocity, liking, scarcity, social proof. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, well, we find sitcoms funnier when there's a laugh track because other people are laughing and we assume that's the correct behavior, and that's due to the principle of social proof. All right, easy questions. Which compliance principle explains why we prefer our mirror image to our regular image? Commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, scarcity. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, well, this is due to the mirror exposure effect. We tend to like things more if we're exposed to them more. And we're talking about liking, so obviously liking is the correct response. Which compliance principle explains why the low ball technique increases compliance? So this one you have to go back to last class. So why does the low ball technique increase compliance? Due to commitment and consistency, liking, social proof, or scarcity? We got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, well, I kind of gave this one away when I said we talked about it last class because only one of these principles did we talk about last class, and that is commitment and consistency. Just to remind you, lowballing is a technique that occurs when you get someone to agree to a certain request, and then only once they've agreed do you increase the magnitude of that request. And because they've agreed already, they feel a need to be consistent and agree with the larger request as well. All right, and finally, question 5. Which compliance principle is demonstrated by the idea that we should treat others as they treat us? Reciprocity, liking, commitment and consistency, social proof. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, well, there's only one left that we haven't talked about, or that hasn't been an answer yet, and that is the principle of reciprocity. This is a pretty easy quiz, I'm sure. It's pretty much a gimme for most people, I think. Okay, so let's move on to a somewhat new topic, although related to what we were just talking about, as I mentioned. So in this section where we talked about social influence, we've looked at 3 types of social influence so far. We looked at conformity, looked at persuasion, we looked at compliance. And at each step, we were ratcheting up the strength of that social influence. And so the last section, we're looking at compliance, which is behavior change in response to a direct request. When we're talking about obedience, we're ratcheting it up even more. We're now talking about behavior change produced not by a request, but by commands of authority. So when an authority figure tells you to do something, that's what we're looking at here, obedience, okay? Now, the researcher who is most associated with looking at obedience, his name is Stanley Milgram. And he partly started researching this topic in the 1950s or so, in response to what he had observed from the Holocaust in World War II. I mean, the question was, after World War II, how is it that Germany got so many people to commit such atrocities against millions of other people? I mean, was it the case that there were just a bunch of psychopaths born in Germany all of a sudden? Probably not, right? There's probably some other influences that were going on that resulted in the rise of fascism, and that resulted in people committing such atrocities against other people. And Stanley Milgram thought that there were maybe some social psychological factors that might have affected people's likelihood of obeying authority, because in a lot of the trials after World War II, a lot of the Nazis were claiming, well, they were just following orders, right? That was the defense that they used a lot of time, that they're just following orders. And Milgram thought that that we might have this almost natural tendency to want to obey authority, to want to obey commands of authority figures. And so he set out to study this systematically. And as a consequence of his research, he produced what is, in my opinion, the most famous study in all of social psychology, bar none. And I want to explain to you what this study is. Now, there are a bunch of different variations of this study that he ran. I'm going to describe to you the basic variation, and we'll talk a little bit about different variations later on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through, from the perspective of a participant, what you would expect if you were participating in this study. Okay, the question he had, though, was how far would people go in the name of following authority? He wanted to see if he could get people to do seemingly atrocious things, horrible, harmful things to other people, just because an authority figure was telling people to do so. He wanted to see how far he can push people. Oops. Okay. So imagine that you have signed up for this study. Okay, you're a participant in the study. And you show up to the lab where the study is being conducted. And when you get there, there's another participant that's there. And you take a seat beside them in this little waiting room. And eventually, after a minute, the experimenter comes out and says, what we're interested in this study is looking at the effects of punishment on learning. We don't really know much about how people learn in response to being punished. And so that's what we're looking at in this study. And so what I've got here, I've got 2 slips of paper. One says teacher, one says learner. I'll explain what that means in a second. Let me just shuffle them up in my hands. He gives it to the partner, the other participant that's there. He draws a slip. He gives you the remaining slip. You open your slip, and it says that you are the teacher. And the partner, the other participant, says they are the learner. So the experimenter tells you the following. Okay. So let me explain to you the study, what you're going to be doing. Now, what I'm going to do here, come with me. I'm going to take you, and what we're going to do, we're going to take the learner, we're going to strap him into this chair. This is the learner, this guy in glasses. Okay. This is the experimenter, and this is the experimenter's assistant. So what they're doing is they're strapping the learner into a chair. There's like some restraints on his wrists so he can't escape. Okay. So you're just watching this all happen. All right, now the learner is able, although he can't move his wrists, he's able to move his hands. So he's going to be responding to a series of questions that you're going to be asking him in the near future by pressing one of a series of buttons on this machine in front of him. Okay, so he can move his hand just enough to do that, but other than that, he can't escape from the chair. Meanwhile, the experimenter, you can see this guy, he's putting this tube of paste, basically, on the back of the arm of the learner. And he says that in a minute, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be hooking up this person to some electrodes. This is some electrode paste. It's just meant to make sure that the shocks don't burn his skin. Okay? And as this guy is being strapped in, he says, look, I'm going to be receiving shocks because I've had some heart issues in the past. I'm just afraid, like, is this going to be harmful to me? Could this kill me? Is this going to be harmful to my heart? And the experimenter says something like, although the shocks are extremely painful, they don't leave any long-lasting skin damage, which is hardly reassuring, right? But regardless, he puts this electrode paste and he hooks some electrodes up to the arm of the learner. Once he's hooked up, the researcher then takes you into an adjacent room. So you're not in the same room with the learner. There's a wall that separates you, basically, but you're right on the other side of that wall. And he places you in front of this big machine. Do I have a picture of it? No, okay. I think I do in 2 slides. I'll show you a picture of that machine in a second. On this machine are a series of switches. And underneath the switches are some labels. Now these switches, the experimenter explains to you, are hooked up. It's basically a shock generator. And it's hooked up to the student, to the learner in the next room. So when you flip one of those switches, it delivers an electric shock to the person in the next room. And there's a series of switches. Underneath each switch is a label that describes how strong the shock is. Now they're in volts, and it starts at 15 volts is the lowest one, and it increases in 15 volt increments, so 15, 30, 45, 60, etc., all the way up to 240 volts. No, sorry, that's not true. All the way up to 450 volts, I should say. Underneath the label that describes how many volts each shock is, each switch delivers, is a verbal descriptor of how strong the shock is. And it starts from slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, extremely strong shock. The last few switches are simply labeled XXX. Now here's what your job is. There's an intercom system, okay? So there's like a microphone in front of you. You can speak into it, and the learner can hear in the next room through this intercom system what you're asking. And so what you're gonna do is, for the first part of the study, you're gonna read a list of word pairs to the learner. So you're gonna say things like blue dress, green house. And what the learner's job is to try to learn the paired words. So what I say, blue dress and green house, those things have to be paired. So once you've gone over this list of word pairs, then you're gonna start at the beginning of the list, and you're gonna say blue. And you're gonna give the learner a list of 4 words: house, dress, dog, cat. And the learner has to indicate which of those options had been paired with that word earlier. Okay, so in that case, it would be dress. Right? And so he does this by hitting one of 4 switches on the machine in front of him at A, B, C, or D. Okay, so you go through this process, and you're told that whenever the learner makes a mistake, whenever they get one of these questions wrong, you have to deliver a shock. So you start at the 15 volt level. You deliver a 15 volt shock. And every subsequent mistake they make, you increase the magnitude of that shock. So the second mistake, you deliver 30 volts, then 45 volts, then 60 volts, etc. So this is basically what the setup looks like. Now in this case, they call the learner the students, doesn't really matter, student, learner, same thing. The main idea is that you are the teacher here in front of the shock generator at the bottom of the screen. That shock generator is hooked up to this device, to these electrodes that are placed on the arm of the student in the other room. And the experimenter is sitting behind you, kind of giving you instructions as you go. Now, for the first, well, okay, let me show you the shock generator. This is what the shock generator looks like. It's kind of a bad picture, I realize. But you can see these are a series of switches. When the switch has been flipped, it stays in a down position. So you can see that on the shock generator, all these switches on the left have already been flipped. And there's all these switches left to flip. And you can't see it here, but there's some verbal labels underneath that describe how strong these shocks are. Okay, so you're instructed to give an increasing shock every time the learner makes another mistake. And for a while, everything goes as planned. But what happens is that when you hit 75 volts, so you've delivered 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, this is the fifth mistake that the learner has made. When you deliver that 75 volt shock, you hear him grunt in the other room, like, oh. And you keep delivering shocks every time he makes a mistake. When you get to 120 volts, you hear him start shouting in pain. You can hear him through the wall shouting in pain. When you get to 150 volts, he screams out, I refuse to continue the experiment. When you get to 200 volts, he starts complaining about his heart. My heart, I told you I have a heart condition, my heart's bothering me now. When you get to 300 volts, he starts screaming, these blood-curdling screams through the wall. And he says, I refuse to answer any more questions. I will not answer, let me out of here. And when you get to 330 volts, you never hear from him again. Now, imagine that you're one of these participants, right? So you're delivering these shocks to this person. And when you get to 75 volts, you hear him grunt. When you get to 120 volts, you hear him shout in pain. And at this point, you're thinking, oh man, I don't know if I want to be doing this. And you look to the experimenter behind you. What should I do? Should we check in on him? Should we stop the experiment? And every time you look to the experimenter, he gives you one of these orders. He's fine, go on. The experiment requires that you go on. It's absolutely essential to go on. You have no choice, you must go on. So now you're faced with this dilemma. On the one hand, you want to stop giving electric shocks because you're harming this person clearly. On the other hand, this experimenter keeps telling you to deliver these shocks. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, the learner is a confederate of the experimenters. It's not an actual other participant. The drawing at the beginning of the study was completely rigged. That person is not actually receiving any electric shocks. It's all an act. It's all faked. Okay? But you believe as the participant, you are delivering electric shocks to that person. And that's the key. Now, what the researcher really wants to know is, will you continue delivering electric shocks to obey the experimenter? Or will you disobey the experimenter and tell him, I'm not delivering any more shocks, that's it, I'm done? What are you going to do? Well, before conducting this study, the researcher, Stanley Milgram, asked a whole bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists and others to predict how many people would go all the way up the shock generator and deliver the strongest possible shock. Now remember, the strongest possible shock is 450 volts. So that is beyond when people have refused to continue the experimenter, after people have complained about their heart, after they've been screaming and refusing to answer, and importantly, after the person has fallen completely silent and you never hear from them. So when you think about this, how many people would keep delivering shocks? Well, when you ask people to predict, what they found was that people would disobey at about 135 volts, a pretty light level of voltage, and that only 1/10% of people would deliver the maximum possible shock of 450 volts. Only the most psychopathic of psychopaths would deliver 450 volts. What actually happened? Well, they were completely and utterly wrong. In fact, not a single person disobeyed before 240 volts. And just to go back and put that in some context, that means every single participant in this study continued delivering electric shocks after the person was shouting in pain, after they refused to continue the experiment, and after they complained about their heart condition. Not a single person stopped delivering what they thought were potentially lethal shocks at that time. And even then, only a small minority of people refused to continue at that point. And people continued delivering, most people continued delivering electric shocks. Oops. So the number drops to about 88% of people obeying up to the intense shock. You get about 68%, about 2/3 of people obeying up to 360 volts. And in fact, it pretty much levels off there. About 2/3 of people, 65% of people, continue delivering shocks all the way to the 450 volt level. Remember, this person fell silent at 330 volts, which means 2/3 of people delivered shocks to people who had potentially died in the next room, not once or twice, but at 330 volts, 335, 345, 360, 375, 390, 405, 420, 435, 450. 9 times these people delivered shocks to someone who's potentially dead in the other room, who was not making any noise, who had refused to continue the experiment, who was complaining about his heart, just because a stranger in a lab coat told him to. This is part of the reason why this study is so famous in social psychology, because it's basically shocking. Okay, that was really, I did not mean to make that pun, but it's shocking just how much people would obey. In fact, I have a video clip from that study that I want to play for you now. It's about 10 minutes long, so it'll take us just about to the end of class. Let me pull this up. Okay, so this is from the original study. This was done in like the 1950s and into the early 60s when they did these studies. So the quality of the recording isn't all that great. It's black and white and kind of jumpy and stuff. But I'm going to show you one guy in particular. And what you're going to see is that as he's delivering shocks to this person, right? He thinks he's delivering shocks, and he hears the person start screaming in pain. You're going to see him continually look to the experimenter, like, what should I do? Should we check in on him? And all the experimenter does is say, go on, you have to go on, continue. It's not your responsibility. Once we started, we can't stop. And you're going to see this guy growing increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that he's delivering shocks, and yet he's seemingly unable to disobey the experimenter. Okay, so let me show you that now. If I can end this, there we go. And you should be able to hear audio. If not, I'm sure you'll let me know in the chat, but you should be able to.
Wrong. 90 volts. Wrong. Volts. 135. Answer woman.
I just want to pause for 1 second, because the fact that he's laughing nervously, that does not mean he finds us funny. This is actually a really common reaction among participants, that it's like they have all this nervous energy and they don't know what to do, and it comes out as this nervous laughter, but they do not find the situation amusing. Just wanted to interject there.
N. White cloud. Horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experimental, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. Next word is sad.
Want me to keep going?
Continue, please.
Oh, sad. Sad. Face, music, clown, girl. Correct. Next one, short. Sentence, movie, skirt, time. Answer, please. Wrong. 165 volts. Time.
Let me out.
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
There's a lot of them here, you know, you have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
standing there. I'm not going to kill that man in there. You hear him hollering? And he's
As I said
crying.
before, the shocks may be painful, but
Yeah,
they're not
but he's in
dangerous.
there hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word
I
pairs.
refuse to take the responsibility of him getting hurt in there. And I'm not, he's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here, and geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. Who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. Answer, please. Wrong. 195 volts. Dance.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here.
Continue,
Don't
please.
bother me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
You see,
Let
he's
me out of here.
hollering
Let me
there.
out. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out. Let me out.
I don't know.
Well, the experiment requires
Well,
that you continue.
I know it does, sir, but you don't know what he's getting in for. He's up to 195 volts. Answer, please. Wrong. 225 volts. The word is noise. New. House pet book name. Answer, please. Correct. Next one, quiet. Song, party, child, evening. Correct. Next one, tame. Wolf, bear, dog, cat. Wrong. Answer is bear. 240 volts. Next one, sweet. Yeah.
No, you go back up to the beginning of that page and go through it again until he's learned them all correctly.
Oh, no, I'm not going to kill that man. You mean I got to keep going up with the scale? No, sir, he's already there. I'm not going to give him 450 volts.
The experiment requires that you
I know
continue.
it does, but that man is hollering in there, sir.
As I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not
but
dangerous.
he's yelling in there.
Start with blue, please, at the top of the page. Continue, please, teacher.
Well, I told him we're going over it again.
No, just go ahead.
Blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Correct. Nice. Day, sky, job, chair. Wrong. Answer is day. 285 volts.
Continue, please.
Fat. Man, lady, tub, neck. Answer, please. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. Okay, well, I won't answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedure as you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer.
Oh, man.
Continue, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. Answer, please.
Go on with the procedure, please, teacher.
315 volts. The answer is ink. Next one.
I refuse to answer.
Well, you gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer. The next one is Rich. 330 volts.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me
Next
out,
one.
I tell you. Let me out. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out.
Excellent.
Let me out.
Fast.
Let me out. Let me out.
Bird. Car. Train. Plane.
Go on, please, with the procedure.
Please answer. The answer is bird. 345 volts. Blunt. Knife, stick, word, arrow. Answer, please.
Continue, please.
The answer is arrow. 360 volts.
Go on, please, with the experiment. Please continue.
Soft. Rug, pillow, hair, grass. Answer, please.
Go on, teacher.
Air. 375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher.
Cool. Day, shade, water, cave. Answer, please. Are you all right in there? Are you all right?
Please continue, teacher.
Oh, you know, I keep giving him shocks.
Continue,
I'm
please.
up to 390.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Next one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon. Next one, heart, stone, head, bread, work. Answer, please. The answer is head, 420 volts. Next one, wet, night, grass, duck, cloth. The answer is duck, 435 volts. Says danger, severe shock here. Next X on the next one.
Continue, please.
435 volts. Next one, brave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Okay, they rescue him shortly after that, but you can obviously see he's in a lot of distress as he believes he's inflicting harm on this person. And that's one of the main points I want to make about this study. It's easy to misconstrue this study as it revealing that we have a sadistic nature to us or something along, something to that effect. And that would be a misinterpretation, I think, of the study. This study does not show that we are naturally evil people or anything like that. What it tends to show, what the purpose of it was in showing that, is that we just have this natural tendency to obey authority figures. It is really, really difficult for us to stand up to authority figures in a lot of situations, which can lead to these sorts of negative effects. And we should really be aware about that, in ourselves. We should be aware that we can be manipulated to sort of mindlessly obey authority figures. And we're going to look into this a little bit more next class. I will leave you with this, though. This was done back in like the 50s and 60s, these studies. The question is, do these levels of obedience still persist into the modern age? So this study cannot be done again for ethical reasons, because the people who were in the study were in a lot of distress, as you can see this guy was. For ethical reasons, we cannot conduct the study for research purposes. However, reality TV shows don't have to follow the same ethical guidelines as scientists do. As a consequence, some reality TV shows have replicated this study. And I'm going to show you a clip next week from a show from probably about 15 years or so where they replicated this. And we're going to see if they still maintain the same levels of obedience. So we're going to see that next week. Okay, I will see you guys then. Have a great Tuesday. I'll see you in a couple days. Bye.